There we go. Hopefully that's better. Okay, we're starting all over. We had a sound issue with the first one. I will go in and delete that. I'm not sure how that works on Rumble. Um, but we'll go in and fix it. It'll be easier just to start with a new broadcast. So welcome, welcome. Happy Wednesday. We should have good sound now. Let me check. Uh, I don't know why I look so orange. My house looks orange. My teeth look orange. I don't know what's going on with that. It's so weird. I promise my teeth aren't orange. Maybe I need to go to a different lipstick. Um, but anyway, I don't know. Just weird light, I suppose. All right, we're good now. Everybody can hear. Hooray! We're on board. Okay, YouTube, I lost your comments when I restarted, but I'm guessing you'll be back up there. Okay, so happy Wednesday. Let's try this again. Um, and I wanted to let you know about everybody's been kind of keeping up with my health. So if you don't know, I had gastric sleeve weight loss surgery 5 years ago. And I did that because I had been so sick with the mast cell disorder that I had been on high dose steroids for a long time, and I put on a bunch of weight. I should find a picture of me here. Um, anyway, put on a bunch of weight, and I couldn't get it off. Even doing the pre-op diet, I couldn't get it off. And so finally, I was like, "This weight is going to kill me. I've got to do something." And I researched everything, and I decided, looking for a picture here, I decided that I was going to go ahead and pursue weight loss surgery. Well, where's my fat pictures? And here they are. Oh, that one's awful. Uh, so, okay, we'll show you this one. This one's not horrible. Let me move this. We'll just close it. Okay, I don't know if you can see that, but that's before and after surgery. Um, now, I'm about 30, 40 pounds heavier than that now, than the thin picture, um, because when I got COVID, there we go. Get my chat back. When I got COVID, I lost 14 pounds because I was so sick and I got really unhealthy looking. And then my thyroid crashed and I gained a bunch of the weight back. And so we're trying to get the thyroid straightened out. It's taken longer than we thought. And so initially, when we started the new thyroid medicine, I lost 12 pounds, no problem. Just, I wasn't even trying. And so we knew it was thyroid, but now the rest is just kind of stuck. So that's not the reason that I'm considering a second surgery. The reason I'm considering a second surgery is because they did the wrong surgery on me in the first place. So if a person has really bad GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, you don't do a gastric sleeve on them, you do a bypass. And they did a gastric sleeve, which makes that condition worse. And so now I have to have that revised to a bypass. So 2 surgeries instead of 1 because they didn't do the right surgery the first time. So Thursday, I went to the first surgeon, which was at St. Joe East, and I know of their program. It's a really good program. And the reason I know of it is I used to help run one of the Facebook support groups for people who had had weight loss surgery. And all of our folks that came from St. Joe East needed very little coaching or, teaching or anything like that. They all just, you could tell they just came from a really good program and they knew what they were doing. I spent 90% of my time coaching and trying to help people from the program that I came from. And it got to the point that it was almost like a full-time job. And I called the surgeon and I'm like, look, you've got to improve your program because I'm spending all my time working for you without pay, basically. And, he's just super arrogant. And anyway, I've had nothing but problems since the surgery. And so I went and saw St. Joe East and I really liked them. And then I had a referral over to University of Hi Troy. I had a referral over to University of Kentucky Hospital, which I think maybe their program is new, or at least I've never met anyone that's had a procedure there, even when I was doing the support group. And I really, really liked them. And I decided to go with St. Joe East, and I'll tell you why. Because if you're having a revision done because you're having problems, they can do that different with the insurance. So if you're just having a weight loss surgery done because you need to lose weight, that can be a 3 to 6 month waiting period because different insurance companies require different things as far as supervised weight loss. Well, I don't really need supervised weight loss. I know how to lose the weight. So I've had all of that education, all of that kind of stuff. I'm just kind of stuck. Um, and the other place is able to put this through as a surgery to fix the problem of a hiatal hernia and esophageal erosion so that I don't have to go through the whole weight loss thing all over again that I've already been through. So I decided to go with them. I liked both programs equally. The only thing that St. Joe East had that UK didn't have was an exercise physiologist, which isn't a deal breaker for me because exercise is pretty simple. Just get out and move. So anyway, that's who I chose. I don't have a surgery date or anything yet. I'm thinking it's probably going to be November or December before I have surgery, but I'll keep you up on that. And it is going to be a much bigger procedure because they do have to go in, fix the hiatal hernia, and then completely reroute my digestive tract. So not looking forward to that. I'm not looking forward to having it done around Thanksgiving or Christmas, but it is what it is. And I need to be able to eat something besides protein shakes, pudding, that's getting old really quick. So anyway, that was kind of my week. Other than that, everything's been really calm. Knock on wood. And hopefully it stays that way. The weather's good here. It's finally sweater weather, and I love sweater weather. I'm from Michigan. If you don't watch Red Pill 78, he's one of my favorites. And he's I don't know if he was the first interview I did, maybe the second. I think I interviewed with him after I'd already interviewed with Stu Peters. But anyway, really, really sweet guy. And there's Red Pill girlfriend Lisa, who I really like. And they're both from Michigan, Ohio, that sort of area. And so Lisa was lamenting that now that they're in Florida, that's not sweatshirt weather. You don't get sweat. She'll get it eventually. She's just going to have to wait a little bit longer. But I thought, yeah, man, I'm excited about sweatshirts. So I went to Goodwill. Goodwill is my favorite place to go for sweatshirts and sweaters because there's just a ton of them. And I'm not all about spending a ton of money on clothes. That's not ever been my thing. And I don't mind wearing pre-loved clothes. I wouldn't buy underwear or bras because that would be super gross. But hey, if you have to do that, no judging. I'm glad you're wearing underwear and bras. But those types of things, swimsuits, I buy new. But basically just sweaters, t-shirts, sweatshirts, things like that. So anyway, that was a good day. Did a little bit of shopping yesterday, and then came home and started getting everything ready to come see you. The reason I'm not down in the RV is because it's cold and because I'm too lazy to get up early and go down there and turn on the heat to let it warm up. And the heat gets really hot in there, so it's kind of hard to podcast from there in the winter. So I've moved up into the kitchen until Mr. Wittbrodt gets the studio done. Mr. Wittbrodt, are you listening? Poor guy. I'm drinking chai tea. Tell me in the chat what you're drinking. It's so good. I love chai tea. A little bit of vanilla creamer, and I've got a little bit of sweetener in it, and it's super yummy. As you can see, I still have a raspy throat, but I think that's just all the stuff that's going on is making it raspy. So if you watched last week, we started the Josiah Manifesto by Jonathan Cahn, and we had previously read The Harbinger 2 by Jonathan Cahn, which was no. The Return of the Gods is what we read. And that one was a really good one. Everybody loved it. So if you didn't get to hear that one, this dust cover. If you didn't get to hear that one, I'll just throw it over there. Then go back and hear that one because it's a really good one. All the books we've read have been really good. The Max Lucado book was awesome. Even a lot of people didn't think that they would enjoy the Velveteen Rabbit, but everybody loved the Velveteen Rabbit. I got a ton of feedback on that one. And it was just one that I did from childhood that was a feel-good book because things were really tense in the news and stuff. And I feel like we need, there's kind of, I don't know if I've ever talked to you guys about this. So when I died and went to heaven, there's a resonance there that's palpable. And so we have it here too. You just can't, we're not as in tune to it and you can't quite feel it. But there, everything has vibration and this beautiful resonance that is musical. And everybody's resonance is sounding at the same time. And it's not like a cacophony or like a middle school band warming up. It's beautiful. It's like an orchestra, and it's not overwhelming. It's so hard to describe because you can still think and you can still kind of block it out and focus on other things. but there was just this incredible resonance, and you could feel it through every part of you. And why am I telling? Oh, and so I was just, kind of praying on things like I do, and I have to watch so much news to get ready for Friday shows, and I'm going to be starting Friday shows back this week because I've been doing pretty good. I didn't want to have another Friday show where I had to leave in the middle of the show. That was embarrassing. But there's this resonance that you don't perceive, and I forget and lose track of it and don't perceive it either if I'm not mindful. And what I've found is that if you're watching a lot of news and you're watching a lot of just the disaster that is this world today, there's a resonance to that, and it's really low, and 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 it doesn't feel good, and most people don't perceive it. And if that's what you're filling your mind with, there's a Bible verse that says, "Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." And that's true. Pay attention to what you're talking about. And if it's constantly politics and the world's a mess and all that kind of stuff, you're resonating at a really low level. You're So if you hit like a tuning fork and you put it near a piano, the piano will begin to hum in resonance with that tuning fork. And we're no different than that tuning fork. So if you're watching things that are really negative all the time or violent, you're playing violent video games, whatever, you start resonating with that thing, and you start kind of being at that lower level of resonance, and you'll find that you get sick more often, that you're more stressed, you're more depressed, your sleep isn't as good, your nutrition will start to suffer because lower resonance people tend to eat junk because they're trying to get that serotonin fix and the dopamine fix from the food. And so I always encourage people, make sure balance is like the most important lesson that we're here to learn. And so you have to balance that negative stuff that you're watching with some good positive things. And so I try to be that here for you guys. Um, but listen to music that is uplifting, not music that is angry or, and that's out there. Listen to music that is uplifting. And if it doesn't sound good to you at first, start training yourself to, it's because that resonance is so different than yours that you've kind of pushed that away. But you can start training yourself to listening to that, classical music. Praise and worship music is really good. Music that you grew up with that you just love, that brings back good memories. Spend some time every day listening to that, and you'll find you feel better. Your mood is better, your health is better, your sleep is better. And so that's part of what we're trying to do here um, with the reading of these books, is to give you some information and education, but to also remind you that there is a higher plane and we can resonate with that. And so anyway, that's how I got onto the idea of doing a book club, because I wanted to share some things like that with you. So we're now on chapter 11. The Entrance of a Spectre is the name of the first section of that. In The Harbinger 2, in a chapter called The Plague, the man known as the prophet opens the mystery behind the calamity that came upon America and the world in 2020. But there is much more than I could have revealed then, mysteries of stunning precision. We now open them. The Footsteps of Moloch. America began practicing abortion on demand in 1970. In a biblical context, the beginning, the first act or event, the first day or first fruit, is of particular significance. So if we had to identify the entrance of abortion on demand onto American soil, the first step of that entrance, what would it be? The year 1970 would see abortion legalized in 4 states. Of those 4, 2 were first in time and most primary. One constituted the first American state to legalize the practice, but the other was the first to legalize the practice on the continent. It would also be the most central and pivotal by far, and introducing and spreading it across the nation. The reasons for this were several. First, the law by which it legalized it was the most expansive. At the time, it was called the most liberal abortion law in the world. Second, the law had no limitation with regard to one's residence. Thus, anyone could come to the state and have an abortion performed. So thousands and thousands of babies were aborted in the state from mothers who resided elsewhere. Third, the state would soon become America's abortion capital. Fourth, by virtue of the last two reasons, the state would become central in spreading the practice and its acceptance throughout American society. And finally, its legalization of abortion on demand would strongly influence the United States Supreme Court in legalizing the practice across the nation. The dark entrance. Hi, Miss Debbie. The state was New York. It was by far the most critical American state in abortion's entrance into the nation. It was New York that introduced abortion to continental America. It was New York that enacted the most extreme of abortion laws up to that point. It was on New York soil that more babies were killed than in any other American state. It was New York that was foremost in the spreading of the practice across the nation, and it was New York that laid the groundwork for the ruling of Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision that made abortion the law of the land 3 years later. In fact, the Supreme Court ruling would refer to New York's abortion law. Is it possible then to find and identify the first act, the first event in the coming of abortion to New York? Constance Cook was a Republican member of the New York State Assembly. She was first elected to the Assembly in 1963 and served until 1974. It was Cook, along with Democratic Assemblyman Franz Leichter, who was responsible for writing the bill that would, upon its passage, ultimately transform New York abortion and America. The bill would legalize abortion on demand in New York and lead to its dissemination throughout the nation. So when was it set in motion? It was set in motion on the day it was introduced into the New York legislature. It was introduced into the legislature on January 20th, 1970. January 20th, 1970 was the seminal day, the first fruit of abortion on demand's entrance into the nation. Patient Zero and the Western Entrance. As the year 2020 began, the world watched with increasing alarm the reports of a new virus originating in the Wuhan province of China. The contagion was soon identified as a new strain of the coronavirus with pneumonia-like symptoms. In the second week of the new year, China reported the first death to be associated with the virus. Up until then, every confirmed case of infection had been confined to China, but that would soon change. A few days after the report of that first fatality, a 35-year-old American man returned home to Seattle after a visit with his family in the Wuhan province of China. He began to feel sick. At first it was just a cough, but it was soon followed by increasingly severe symptoms. He decided to get tested. The test samples were rushed on an overnight flight to a lab in Atlanta. The next day, the results came back. The man was infected with COVID-19. It was the first official confirmation that the contagion had entered American soil. He was placed in a plastic-covered isolation gurney and transported to a containment ward designed for highly contagious diseases. Those assigned to his care wore helmets and face masks, while a robot took his vitals. But it was too late. He had already come into contact with others. He would become one of the central conduits for the spreading of the plague into America. The specific strain of the contagion that he had brought to Seattle would later be found throughout the nation. He would be known as Patient Zero, America's official herald of the plague. The Day of Two Specters. Abraham Lincoln drew the connection between the blood drawn by the lash of slavery and that drawn by war. Jeremiah spoke of the connections between the blood of the children sacrificed on the nation's altars and the judgment that would come by sword and plague. What about the two deaths that entered American soil, one in 1970 and the other 50 years later in 2020? What happens if we take the beginning of abortion, its first fruit, its first act, the seminal day of its entrance, January 20th, 1970, and count forward the full span of the Jubilee 50 years? Where does it take us? It takes us to January 20th, 2020. January 20th, 2020 was the day the plague officially struck America. It was the day of patient zero. That day it was confirmed that the contagion had entered the nation. Date of entry, January 20th, 1970, January 20th, 2020. Thus the plague began its entrance into America on the same exact date that abortion on demand began its entrance into America. Beyond that, the two dates were joined together by the exact 50-year duration of the Jubilee. Or in other words, the death brought by abortion and the death brought by the plague each entered the land on the same exact day. The Jubilee brings reversal and restitution. So on the Jubilee of the day that began America's taking of life, the plague would come to take the lives of the generation that had taken the lives of the children. The one was the inversion of the other, and the 2 days would be joined together by the Jubilee, 50 years to the year, to the month, to the week, and to the exact day. No human hand could have joined those two events. The plague came as plagues come, through the smallest and most microscopic of causes and effects. But the timing of those microscopic actions and interactions was exact. The seeding. Each of the two events represented the first fruit of abortion and the first fruit of the plague, and each was a seeding. The seeding on January 20th, 1970 would bring death to countless children. The seeding on January 20th, 2020 would bring death to countless adults. Each represented the beginning of the beginning, a single act of introducing a single law and a single case of contagion. Neither would remain single. Each seed of death would become fruitful and multiply. Each of the 2 days would constitute the beginning of something ominous. Death would beget death, and the second death would come on the exact Jubilean day of the first. In the year of return would come the return of death. At the moment, America was about to embark on a course that would lead to the killing of millions of unborn children. A word was given. The origins of that word were ancient, going back 3,000 years to the miraculous birth of an ancient nation. Good Lord, on this day. We can get our pages turned here. Chapter 12. They Who Open the Womb. America was founded after the pattern of ancient Israel. Those who laid the first of its foundation stones in Massachusetts Bay spoke of its calling in terms of a holy commonwealth, an Israel of the New World. And in the days of the American Revolution, the nation's departure from English rule was likened to the exodus of Israel from the rule of Pharaoh. The law of birth. One of the distinctions that separated Israel from the nations that surrounded it was the prohibition against the killing of children. The neighboring Canaanites were especially known for offering their children as sacrifices to their gods. Israel was warned by their prophets never to take part in such horrors. Just after Israel's exodus from Egypt, it was given a unique law concerning birth, the womb, and one's children. It would become known as the law of the firstborn. Steve. Implicit in the ordinance was another scriptural principle. One's child was a gift from God. Thus one could not do to one's child as one pleased, or as the pagans did to their children. You shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb. The child of one's womb was holy. They were to be treated as such. Birth was sacred. Life was a miracle, and one's children, as represented by the firstborn, belonged to God. A word from God. Every Sabbath day in synagogue across the world, the Jewish people recite an appointed passage of Scripture. The passage is called the parasha. Each passage is appointed from ages past to be read on a specific Sabbath day. So every week on the Sabbath, the scrolls are opened in virtually every synagogue, and the appointed passage is read, chanted, and proclaimed. The same passage throughout the world. Just before America set in motion the laws that would legalize abortion in New York on January 20th, there was an appointed scripture to be chanted in the synagogues of America and the world. It was the last scripture to be chanted before those critical days of America's descent into child killing. Of what did it speak? It spoke of the nation's children. It spoke of the moment of birth, the moment the unborn child opens the womb, and it declared that the child who opens the womb is sacred, set apart, and belongs to God and is to be consecrated to Him. They who would never open the womb. So just as the moment that America was to embark on legalizing the killing of its unborn children, to stop them from opening the womb, to take the miracle of life, the gift of God, and dispose of it, it was then that this scripture was proclaimed throughout its cities and towns. It would be proclaimed especially in New York, the center of America's Jewish population. New York was the very place where abortion would first be set in motion. The children who would be killed because of that week would eventually number into the tens of millions. They would never open the womb. They would be terminated before they could. And yet the word of God and the appointed word for that moment declared them holy, sacred, and precious. And so it was proclaimed in the land just before America embarked on its dark journey, and before any of those lives, precious to God and belonging to Him, were killed in the womb. We are now going to open the mystery of the 2 days, the days when everything changed. We will find that lying behind them was an ancient mystery. Chapter 13, The Day Everything Changed. Is it possible for us to identify the exact moment abortion on demand actually began in America? And if so, would it bring forth a revelation? The Hawaiian Death. On February 20th, 1970, the Hawaiian House of Representatives passed its abortion bill. 4 days later, the Hawaiian Senate passed the same bill. It was then sent to the governor. The governor was a Catholic and believed that abortion was wrong. It wouldn't be until the middle of March that the next step would be taken. Up to the middle of March, abortion's entrance into America was spotty and in steps. It had gained momentum and, in the case of Hawaii, had gained the needed votes, but it hadn't actually been enacted. 50 years later, Americans would watch nervously as signs of the plague appeared in their land. Its advance was likewise spotty and scattered. With regard to the total population, its effect was minuscule. Up to early March, the numbers of those Americans infected with the disease was reckoned to be at most a few hundred out of a population of over 300 million. The plague was approaching, but had not broken out. It had not yet fallen on the nation. Month of impact, March 1970, March 2020. With the entrance of abortion to America, the moment when everything changed came in March of 1970. It was then that the Hawaiian governor, though without putting his name on the bill, decided he would let it pass. And so the legalized killing of children in America began in March 1970. We have seen the ancient biblical connection between the killing of children and the entrance of death, in this case through a plague. We have seen the mystery jubilee in the plague that came on the land 50 years after the killing of children began. So as abortion on demand came to America in 1970, the plague came to America in 2020. But it could be even more exact. If the actual killing of children on American soil began in the month of March 1970, then the mystery would ordain that death would come to America 50 years later, in March of 2020. Did it? It did. The plague fell upon the nation in March of 2020, the Jubilean month of the children's blood. I got sick March 12th, 2020, interestingly. As March began, the number of Americans infected with the virus stood at around 300. As March ended, the number had skyrocketed to around 175,000. It had taken over a month to get from 1 case to 300 cases, but less than a month to go from 300 to over 175,000. As March of 1970 had marked the coming of the children's blood on American soil, March of 2020 marked the coming of the plague to American soil. And yet the correlation would be even more exact. In the middle of March. The legalization of abortion came more specifically in the middle of March 1970. Therefore, if the mystery is to hold, we would expect death and calamity to come to America exactly 50 years later, in the middle of March of 2020. And so it did. The plague fell not only in the month of March, but in the middle of that month. In fact, the events of that time were so dramatic that for most Americans, the middle of March 2020 would be indelibly burned in their memories of the coming of the virus and the changing of their lives. It was in the middle of March that America became a nation under quarantine. It was in the middle of March that the nation's president ordered a ban on non-U.S. citizens entering the land from 26 European nations. It was in the middle of March 2020 that the World Health Organization declared the plague a pandemic, noting that cases of disease beyond China had increased 13-fold. It was in the middle of March that the American president issued a proclamation that declared that America was now in a state of emergency. It was in the middle of March when, in the view of the lightning speed of the pronouncements made by its government and the events that surrounded them, much of the nation went into a state of panic. And it was in the middle of March that Americans witnessed the beginning of something unprecedented. For the first time in its history, America was being shut down. Stores were shut down. Schools were shut down. Businesses were closed. Movie theaters, Broadway theaters, sports stadiums, even churches were shut down. The nation went into a state of paralysis. Life was frozen. Cities turned into ghost towns. People stayed hidden behind the walls of their homes, afraid to venture out in fear of the deadly plague that was now passing through the land. Date of impact, March 11th, 1970, March 11th, 2020. And yet, could the mystery be even more exact? In mid-March 1970, Hawaiian Governor John Burns informed his state that it would now be legal to kill one's unborn child. House Bill 61, relating to Hawaii's century-old abortion law, is now Act 1 of 1970. The measure became law without my signature. This is what John Burns had heard said, I guess. With that announcement, abortion on demand came upon American soil. What day was it? March 11th, 1970. This is the exact date when abortion on demand became legal on American soil. What then happens if one takes the years of the Jubilee and begins a countdown starting from that day? It leads to the date of March 11th of 2020. So the exact Jubilean day of abortion on demand in America is March 11th, 2020. Did anything significant happen on that day? The following is the title given to an article on National Public Radio. March 11th, 2020, the day everything changed. While some changes happened gradually, there was one day that marked the beginning of the new normal, March 11th, 2020. On that day in the United States, the pandemic future arrived all at once. The pinpointing of March 11th, 2020, as the date the plague fell, the day that everything changed, is virtually universal. From other articles, March 11th, 2020 began in one reality and virtually ended in a new one. The day everything changed, a timeline, March 11th, 2020. On March 11th, 2020, the American public finally began to come to grips with a stark reality. On March 11th, 2020, the day COVID swallowed everything, so many forces of history, years in the making, converged on March 11th and were all subsumed by something few thought possible just weeks earlier. March 11th, 2020 was the day everything changed. March 11th, 2020 was the day that Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, was summoned to Capitol Hill to testify before the House Committee on oversight and reform. When he was asked by members of Congress what he believed would happen, he said, "Things will get worse." March 11th, 2020 was the day that the World Health Organization announced, oh, there's a typo. March 11th, 2020 was the day that the World Health Organization announced that what had happened upon the world and was now gripping America was nothing short of a pandemic. March 11th, 2020 was the day the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 1,400 points. March 2020 was the day that the stock market closed 20% lower than its February peak to enter bear market territory. March 2020 was the day that the 11-year American bull market came to an end. March 2020 was the day multiple U.S. cities started banning large public gatherings. March 2020 was the day that high-profile universities such as Princeton and Notre Dame suspended their classes. March 2020 was the night, as one article put it, that sports as we knew them ended. March 2020 was the day that would be marked as the official beginning of the lockdown in America. It was the day that the American president came on the air in prime time to address the nation concerning the plague. It was in that address that he made the stunning announcement that America would be, in effect, quarantined from Europe. March 2020 was the day everything changed, the day the full force and reality of the plague began to fall on America. The day everything changed. Thus the day the plague fell upon the nation was one jubilee, 50 years to the exact day that abortion officially came to American soil. Most Americans knew that what they were witnessing that day was historic and unprecedented, but they had no idea it was part of an ancient mystery as old as the prophet Jeremiah and the Valley of Hinnom. Nor did they have any idea of its connection to the ancient evil that America had embraced on the same date, exactly 50 years before. But it was fitting that March 11th, 2020 should be called the day that everything changed, as it was the Jubilean day of the other day, 50 years earlier, the other day that everything changed. With regard to its timing, the plague was uncannily precise, but now we will see that its precision manifested not only in the realm of time, but space, as we uncover the American Gehenna. Guess that's right. Chapter 14, the American Gehenna. One cannot speak of the coming of abortion to America and the coming of the plague without speaking of the place to which they came. I began pointing to that place in the Harbinger 2. Now we go deeper. Valley of Slaughter. When Jeremiah prophesied to his people of the children they had sacrificed, he spoke not only of the coming judgment, but of the place to which that judgment would come. Because they have forsaken me and made this an alien place, and have filled this place with the blood of the innocents, they have also built the high places of Baal, to burn their sons with fire for burnt offerings, to Baal. Therefore, this place shall no more be called Tophet, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. In other words, the judgment would return to the place where the evil had been committed. As they had slaughtered their children in the valley of Hinnom, so the valley would become the site of their own slaughter. The site would later be called Gehenna, a name that would become synonymous with hell. If the valley of Hinnom was the ground on which Israel had slaughtered its children, what then would America's valley of Hinnom, the American Gehenna, be? Finding Hinnom. It would have to be the central ground on which the blood of its children was shed. There is only one possible place: New York. New York was the nation's abortion capital, the ground on which more of its children were killed than any other. It was and is America's Valley of Hinnom. The mystery would thus ordain that the plague would turn its focus and fury to the ground of New York, and that is exactly what happened. The most critical span of time in New York's legalization of abortion was March 1970 into the first 10 days of April. From the first days of March to its final days, New York's abortion bill came up in no fewer than 8 of its legislative sessions. And then, in early April, it all came to a head. Adding 50 years to that pivotal time period brings us to March 2020. March of 2020 would in turn be critical with regard to the plague's entrance into New York. The plague officially came to New York on the first day of March. In March of 1970, the movement to legalize abortion in New York gained strength and momentum, so the plague gained momentum and strength in New York 50 years later, in March of 2020. Capital of the plague. March of 1970 was also critical in the legalization of abortion in America. So it was in March of 2020 that the plague's focus turned to America. By March 24th, 1 of every 3 new cases was appearing in America, and on March 26th, the nation crossed a critical threshold. It overtook China to become the plague's global epicenter. And as New York was central in the coming of abortion to the land, so it would be central in the coming of the plague. When America became the global epicenter, almost 1 out of every 2 cases was focused on just a small sliver of America, New York. And a massive part of those cases were in turn focused on the even tinier sliver of New York City. As precise as the plague had been with regards to its days and timing, so too it was with regard to its place and grounds. Death had returned to the time from which it came, but also to the place. As with the Valley of Hinnom, the place where the children's blood was shed became the center of another death. New York had become the plague's new global epicenter and capital. The ancient mystery had ordained it. Dark Milestone, April 10, 1970, April 10, 2020. Abortion was first legalized in Hawaii. Less than 1 month later, it came to the American mainland through New York. It was finalized by vote in the New York State Senate on April 10th. Adding the 50 years of the Jubilee brings us to April 10th, 2020. It was 50 years later, in the second week of April 2020, the plague's fury as touching New York reached its peak. It was the Jubilean week of New York's legalization of abortion. At the same time, another dark milestone was passed. New York now had more cases of the plague than any other nation on earth. In fact, compared with China, it had almost twice as many. When was that dark milestone reached? It happened on April 10th, the very same day that the state had cast its final deciding vote to legalize abortion. It happened 50 years later on the exact same day. The 2 ancient elements, the children's blood and the deadly plague, were again joined together in exact precision. During the days of the plague's fury, the epicenter of the epicenter of the epicenter, New York City, was eerily quiet. Its streets were empty of cars, its stores and squares empty of people, but its mortuaries were filled and overflowing. As the death prophesied by Jeremiah had returned to the ancient valley of Hinnom, death had now returned to the American Johanna. The scripture assigns much significance and even mystery to the gates of a city or kingdom. What about the gates of America? We are now going to reveal how America's gates were central in a modern mystery, one that even involved the plague's genetic markers. Chapter 15. The Eastern and Western Gates. Jeremiah was told to go to the Valley of Hinnom by the Potsherd Gate in order to give his prophecy concerning what the nation had done to its children. The valley was by the gate. The nation had committed its darkest and most gruesome of evils there by the gate. The Eastern Gate. America is not a walled city, but it does have gates, entryways to and from the rest of the world. Could the gates of America, like the gates of ancient Israel, be linked to the darkest of the nation's sins? America's greatest and most famous gate is and has always been that of New York City, the gate through which millions have come in and gone out. In the case of Israel, its children were murdered by the gate. So too in the case of America, it was by the gate that the nation had murdered its children. In the scriptures, the gate was also connected to calamity and judgment. Judgment would come in as the nation's enemies broke through the gates to bring destruction. Judgment began at the gate, and so too a biblical form of judgment, the plague, came especially to the gate of America, New York. Death through the gate. But a gate is not only that which one comes to, but that which one comes through. So New York was not only the gate to which abortion came, but the gate through which it spread to the rest of the nation. When New York legalized abortion in 1970, it was only the beginning. Because of its expansive abortion laws, because of the multitudes who came to the state to have abortions, New York became the primary gateway through which abortion came to America. The state's role as the nation's abortion portal was colossal. In 1970, the first year of its legalization, of all the abortions performed in America, over 45% of them were performed in New York. In its second year, 1971, over half of all abortions in America, 55%, were performed in New York. And in the last year before Roe v. Wade, over 51% of all abortions in America were performed in New York. So of all abortions performed in America from 1970s until Roe v. Wade, most of them were performed in New York. New York was the nation's gate of death. Gate of the plague. This leads us to the next question. If New York served as the central gate and portal through which abortion spread to America, is it possible that it also served as the central gate and portal through which the plague spread to America? To discover the answer, we must add to the ancient mysteries of the gate, of judgment, and of the Jubilee, the discoveries of modern virology and genomic sequencing. The mystery of the Jubilee would point to the 50th year, or 2020, as the year of inversion and return. The principle of return and inversion would indicate that the gate and portal through which the one form of death spread to the nation in the 1970s would be the same gate and portal through which another death, a plague, would spread through the nation 50 years later. Did it? The primary gateway and seeder of outbreaks. The answer comes from the discoveries of modern virology and genomic sequencing as concerning the plague's spread across America. An article in the New York Times reveals it. The research indicates that a wave of infections swept from New York City through much of the country before the city began setting social distancing limits to stop the growth. That helped to fuel outbreaks in Louisiana, Texas, Arizona, and as far away as the West Coast. So not only was New York, and specifically New York City, the center of the plague, it was the central gate through which it came. The article continues the conclusions of a Yale epidemiologist. We now have enough data to feel pretty confident that New York was the primary gateway for the rest of the country. Thus, the same primary gateway of death through which abortion came to America would now become the primary gateway of death through which the plague would come to America. We have seen the critical role that March of 1970 played in abortion's entrance into both New York and America. That makes the next discovery concerning New York and the first days of March 2020 even more profound. By early March, the city became the primary source of new infections in the United States. New research reveals as thousands of infected people traveled from the city and seeded outbreaks around the country. The Eastern Portal, 1970-2020. When we looked at New York's role as the nation's gateway of abortion, the results were stunning. The state or city accounted for more than half of all the cases of abortions performed in America. What about its role as the gateway for the plague? The answer is no less stunning. Of all America's cases of the pandemic, more than half of them came through the gate and the portal of New York. The city, one of the scientists commented, acted as the grand central station for the virus, with the opportunity to move from there in so many directions to so many places. According to the research, the percentage of American cases that originated in New York was a colossal 60 to 65%. It had a precedent. 50 years earlier, out of all children legally killed in America, the percentage of those killed in New York was likewise colossal. Or to put it another way, for most Americans who were struck by the plague, it came to them through the gate of New York City. The other. Though abortion on demand came to the American continent through New York, there was one other state on the American mainland, and only one, that followed New York's lead in legalizing abortion that year. Its legalization would come by referendum and much later in the year. It was the state of Washington. So in 1970, abortion came to the American mainland through two portals, though, as with every other state, the impact of the state of Washington with regard to abortion could not compare with that of New York. It still played a pivotal role as the only other state in mainland America to legalize the act. So the legalized killing of children came to the American mainland through two gateways, one on its east coast and the other on its west, through an eastern gate and a western gate. The Western Gate. What then happens if we approach the Western Gate in view of the ancient mystery? In accordance with the Jubilee, there would be a return. The gate through which death entered the nation from the west in the form of abortion would, in the Jubilean year, be the gate through which death in the form of a plague would enter from the west, in the form of a plague. And this is exactly what would happen. In the Jubilean year of abortion's entrance into America through the Western Gate, death would return and again enter through the same gate. In other words, the plague would enter America through Washington state. 2 gates in 2 years. So as abortion came to the American mainland through 2 gateways in the Jubilean year, a plague would come to the American mainland through 2 gateways. The 2 states through which the plague entered the land in 2020, New York and Washington, just happened to be the same exact 2 states through which abortion entered the land 50 years earlier, one through the nation's eastern gate of death, the other through its western gate of death. The Western Portal, 1970-2020. The genetic markings left in the wake of the plague bore witness to the ancient mystery, as they pointed to the nation's gates. In the case of the Eastern Gate, as we have seen, the findings were overwhelming, accounting for more than half of the nation's COVID cases, just as it had accounted for more than half of the nation's abortions. But what about the Western Gate? The findings, as concerning the Western Gate, were also striking. The genetic markers revealed that in states such as California, Oregon, and Wyoming, 1/3 of all cases bore the genetic markers of having entered the country through Washington state. Even in states such as Illinois in the Midwest, it was found that 27% of cases had come through the Western Gate. And even in states as far away as Georgia on the East Coast, 30% of cases were found to have come through the Western Gate. Patient zero at the gate. There was one more connection. The plague made its official entrance into America on January 20th, 2020, when it was confirmed that it had entered America through patient zero. But where in America did that take place? Patient zero landed in Seattle, the state of Washington. In other words, he entered the continent through the same Western Gate through which abortion had spread to the nation. Through patient zero, the plague struck the nation at its Western Gate, and there ignited its first official outbreak before spreading through the nation. It was the convergence of space and time at the two same gateways. For the day that marked the plague's entrance into America from the Western Gate was January 20th, the same day that abortion began its entrance into America through the Eastern Gate. So on that day of the plague's arrival, both the Eastern and Western gates through which the nation's sin had entered were joined together. The plague came to the nation's Western Gate one Jubilee, 50 years to the exact day that abortion had come to its Eastern Gate. It was the year and day of return, so it was there and then that it returned. The genetic witnesses. The two gates would now usher in an era in which millions of Americans would be struck or struck down. The overwhelming majority of these would bear the plague's viral markers. The plague's viral markers would point to either one or the other of the two gates, the Eastern or the Western. In other words, those struck by the plague would bear in their bodies the markers that joined them to the same two gates through which the nation's darkest of sins had 50 years earlier entered the land. The genetic sequences would bear witness to the two gates of darkness. The ancient mystery had been fulfilled. The calamity had returned to the gate, and death to the place of the children's blood. We must now ask the unasked question, that which is framed by the words of the ancient prophets and at least one American president. None of them had the ability to quantify the calamities of their day and to arrive at the answer, but we do. Chapter 16, The Winds of Hinnom. It was there from the beginning, implicit in Jeremiah's prophecy over the valley of Hinnom and Lincoln's second inaugural address. It is a question that must have seemed in past times, as it does now, almost unaskable. We must now ask it. Jeremiah had foretold the correlation between the blood of the children shed in the valley of Hinnom and the blood to be shed in Jerusalem through war. Lincoln had posed the possibility that the war could go on until every drop of blood drawn by the lash of slavery was matched by another drawn by the sword of war. In each case, the judgment was connected to the evil that invoked it. The children's blood in the valley of Hinnom would be answered and matched with the blood of the nation that shed it. The blood of American slaves would be answered and matched by the blood of American soldiers. Death will be answered and matched by death. So now the question that must be asked, is it possible that the ancient correlation between sin and judgment, the killing of children and a deadly plague, could involve not only their times, days, dates, events, locations, durations, and origins, but their scope, their magnitude, breadth, and their immensity? In other words, could there be any connection or correspondence between the numbers of children killed by abortion and the number of Americans killed by the plague? If so, in what periods of time could the two be measured and compared? It's already clear. There is one clear window of time concerning the entrance and establishment of abortion in America, that which begins with abortion's entrance into the nation and ends with its establishment in the Supreme Court decision that made it the law of the land. Its entrance into America began on January 20th, 1970, and its establishment was sealed on January 22nd, 1973, or for the purpose of available statistics, the 3-year period of 1970, 71, and 72, ending on December 31st. With regard to the plague, it would have to begin with the same parameters, with its official entrance into America. So the window begins on January 20th, 2020. The second window of time would have to parallel the period. So the parameters of the second period with regard to the plague would start in late January of 2020 and go to late January 2023. Or if we were to compare it with the statistics available for abortion, the 3-year period of 2020, 2021, and 2022, and ending on December 31st. Of course, with all such figures, there will always be the factor of underreporting on one hand or overreporting on the other. We are also dependent on the availability of the statistics. National statistics on abortion for the period of our inquiry were typically recorded by year as opposed to by month. General number in each case. So could there be any connection or correspondence between the number of children killed in abortion between 1970 and the start of 1973 and the number of Americans killed by the plague 50 years later in between 2020 and the start of 2023? The children's number. As to the number of children killed in the first 3 years of abortion's entrance into America and up to Roe v. Wade, we have the yearly abortion statistics from the Johnston Archive. These are also the same statistics listed by the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, on abortion as reported from 1969 to 1972. According to these statistics, the number of abortions in America for the first year of our period, 1970, was 193,491. The number for the second year, 1971, was 485,816. And the number for the third year, 1972, was 586,760. Adding up the totals of each year brings the total number of abortions for the 3-year period to 1,266,067. The plague number. What about the number of Americans killed by the plague in the 3 corresponding annual periods of 2020, 2021, and 2022? For this, we have the CDC mortality statistics. They include not only the statistics of deaths attributed solely to the virus, but the other deaths caused by COVID-19, such as pneumonia and influenza. It thus represents the total number of deaths caused by the virus. We have the total excess deaths in America as recorded in the CDC mortality statistics as attributable to the virus in the period beginning in late January to January 21st, 2023. The number is 1,286,050. And so the number for abortions was 1,266,067. Thus, the number of Americans dying from the plague in that period is 1,286,050, and the number of children killed by abortion in the corresponding period is 1,266,067. In view of the data and its margin of error, the two figures are statistically identical. But it goes further. The numbers of excess deaths by COVID contain an extra 21 days in January that the abortion statistics are without for the lack of monthly recordings. The number of excess deaths for those 21 days is 18,085. If we adjust accordingly, subtracting the number from the total excess deaths of the 3-year period, it comes out to 1,267,965. So the number of American children killed in the first 3-year period of legalized abortion is 1,266,067. The number of Americans killed by COVID in the first 3-year period of the plague is 1,267,965. 1,266,067 and 1,267,965, again, the figures are statistically identical and even more so. 1.3 million, 1.3 million. Another major study on the mortality rates caused by COVID-19 was undertaken by the British newspaper The Economist. It is considered one of the most comprehensive and rigorous studies made of the excess death rates caused by the virus. The results involve estimates but provide a ballpark figure. For the 3-year period beginning January 1st, 2020 and ending January 23rd, 2023, The Economist's estimate of those Americans killed by the plague directly or through complications comes out to approximately 1.3 million. The comparable number of children killed by abortion in the parallel 3-year period falls at 1.26 million. But again, the abortion statistics do not include the 23 days of January covered in the Economist study. If one adds in an average daily rate of abortions in accordance with that period and multiplies it by 23 for the days accounted for in the Economist study, It brings the number of abortions for the 3-year period of January 1970 to January 22nd, 1973 to 1.3 million. Percentages of correlations. How close is the correlation of the CDC's number of total deaths caused by the plague, 1,267,965, and its number of children killed by abortion in the corresponding period, 1,266,067? The percentage correlation is 99.85%. As for the economist's approximate figures on COVID deaths compared with the number of children killed by abortion, the correlation is 100%. Conclusions. When Lincoln pondered the correspondence of blood drawn by the lash of slavery with the blood drawn by the Civil War, there were no statistics on the lashings of slavery. When Jeremiah prophesied of the correspondence of the children sacrificed on the altars and the slaughter of his countrymen by the sword, there were no statistics on either. We don't know how close the correspondence was, but in this case we do. The correspondence is stunningly precise, and all the other correspondence we have seen between the two, their inceptions, their inversions, the years, the months, the dates, the locations, they were all warning of this one. What would we have expected of a nation that had shed so much innocent blood? We would have expected the winds of Hinnom, and so they came. But America had not killed 1.3 million children at the time of this writing. It has killed over 60 million children. The winds of their killings have not yet fully blown, and can we rest in the assurance that they never will? We will now open up a very different stream of mystery, one of kings, priests, temples, and gods, and one particularly infamous queen. The replaying of this mystery is specific, precise, and exact, and it holds the secret of one of the most memorable leaders in recent times. Jehu and the Temple of Baal, or Baal. Hi, Anita. I love that you guys are liking the numbers. Hi, Androdite. Peace out, bud. Chapter 17, the prototype. The template we are about to uncover is over 2,500 years old. It contains ancient events, ancient movements, and ancient people. And yet, it will provide us with precise revelation concerning events, movements, and even people of the modern world, even of our own day. The tupos. In 1 Corinthians 10, the Apostle Paul writes of the fall and judgment of the ancient Israelites. Then he adds, "Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition." Behind the English word examples is the Greek word tupos. Tupos can also be translated as a pattern, a model, a template, a prototype. In other words, what happened to ancient Israel as recorded in the scriptures happened and was recorded as examples, as patterns for future generations. Thus they serve as templates to give instruction, warning, insight, and revelation. Such templates, though they may be prophetic, are not the same as prophecies. They are not so much foretelling a specific future event as revealing principles and patterns that future events may follow or be conformed to. The underpinnings of such things derive from God's sovereignty and omniscience. He who knows every event and every moment of human history, past, present, and future, is able to weave into those events, moments, and history, patterns, templates, and paradigms. The correspondence between the ancient template we are about to open and modern American history is detailed and precise. Whether or not it has replayed itself or found parallel in past times, or will do so again in the future, it has done so in our time and with intricate specificity. Man of controversy. I first opened the template in the book, The Paradigm. We will now center a single piece of that template, a man of controversy, an enigma, and his relationship to a certain pagan temple. Since the book was released, the mystery in the template have not stopped unfolding and progressing. Well, Good night. There we go. We will first set up the template with regard to the man of controversy, and then of his connection to a pagan temple. Then I will open up what I have revealed in the paradigm or any book, namely that which has come true after the book was released. It will involve one of the most controversial events of modern times and the ancient mystery that lies behind it. Chapter 18, A Man Named Jehu. Could an ancient figure and mystery lie behind one of the most controversial leaders of our times? Beyond politics. The mystery contained in the ancient template is not a political one. It touches every realm, including that of politics, but it is not of the political realm. It is beyond it. The pieces of the template will fall where they will fall regardless of politics. And though the template involves people, leaders, and prominent figures on the American national stage, it is not ultimately about them. They are only pieces of a larger picture. None of them move and act with any awareness of their place in the template or of the ancient mystery they follow. This especially applies to the piece of the template paradigm on which we will center our focus, the man of controversy. It's not about him. It doesn't matter what one thinks of him or where one stands regarding him. The template, in that sense, is neutral. Its purpose is to reveal. The unlikely vessel. The northern kingdom of ancient Israel was racing away from God. Not only was it a departure, it was now a war. Those who sat on the nation's thrones and those who stood at the pinnacle of its culture actively campaigned against the ways of God. And those who held true to God's ways now found themselves marginalized and vilified. If the nation's course continued unaltered, the end would be judgment and destruction. It was then that a man named Jehu began a campaign to take the nation's throne. He was an unlikely figure. He was not a member of the ruling house, nor a politician, and many would see him as unqualified to sit on the king's throne. A man named Trump. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, America's fall from God was accelerating and solidifying its hold on the ruling institutions of government and culture. Those who sought to uphold the ways of God, those who held to the values and faith on which the nation had been founded, now found themselves marginalized, vilified, and increasingly treated as enemies of the mainstream culture. It was then that a man named Trump began a campaign to take the White House. He had no idea, but he was following after the pattern of an ancient king, Jehu. He would walk in his footsteps and repeat his acts. Jehu was the prototype, and Trump was the antitype. Like Jehu, Trump was an unlikely contender. He was not a member of America's political establishment. He was not a politician. And many saw him as unfit to govern. Jehu was a controversial and polarizing figure. He was loved by some, hated and feared by others. So too was Trump. The enigma. Though Jehu would invoke the name of God, the Bible never speaks of him as a man of God. As to where his heart was, it was a mystery, and it remains a mystery to this day. By his ways, acts, and nature, he could be judged as an ungodly man. Even Scripture calls his relationship with God into question. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, for he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. And yet the Scriptures are also clear that Jehu was used of God. Regardless of his ways and intentions, he was an instrument. Even those ways and acts that could be seen as reckless and ungodly were used to bring about judgment and reformation. Jehu was a vessel of God's purposes, even if a most unlikely one, even if in spite of himself. As did Jehu, Trump would invoke the name of God, but few would speak of him as a man of God, as with Jehu. Trump was an enigma, and as for where his heart was with regard to God, that remained a mystery. Many judged him as an ungodly man, and yet Trump was used of God. He had been, as was Jehu, an unwitting vessel. As with Jehu, his faults and ways did not nullify the fact that he was used as an instrument for God's purposes. Nor, as with Jehu, did the fact that he was used as an instrument for God's purposes nullify his faults and ways. God will use whom he will. Hi, Miss Lindsay. Madman driver. Jehu was a warrior, a fighter. Trump was a fighter, a man who fought with almost everyone and thrived on it. The biblical account of Jehu's rise to power presents a picture of wilderness, impulsiveness, and unpredictability. Trump was seen by supporters and opponents alike as a wild, impulsive, and unpredictable. Jehu's ascent to the throne began as he mounted a chariot and embarked on a race to the capital city and the seat of governmental power. Jehu was said to have driven his chariot as one who was crazy, a madman. Trump's race to the White House was described in similar terms. The alliance. In the midst of his race to the throne, Jehu made an alliance with the religious conservatives of the land. So in the midst of his race to the White House, Trump made an alliance with the religious conservatives of the nation. More specifically, Jehu formed an alliance with one particular man who represented the religious conservatives of the land. Geez, the name. Jehonadab. Jehonadab was known for his piety and his lifestyle of abstinence from alcohol. Jehonadab accepted Jehu's invitation to join him in his chariot. The two then rode together in Jehu's race to the throne. Trump likewise made an alliance with one man, Mike Pence. Pence would likewise represent the religious conservatives of the land, as was Jehonadab. So Pence was known for his piety and his lifestyle of abstinence from alcohol. Actually, Trump was abstinent from alcohol. Pence accepted Trump's invitation to join him in the race to the White House. The two would finish the race together. In the 12th year, Jehu would succeed King Joram. Joram had been in power on the national stage for 12 years when Jehu came to power. Trump would succeed Barack Obama. Obama had come to the national stage in the Democratic Convention of 2004. Trump came to power in the presidential election of 2016. As Jehu came to power at the end of Joram's 12 years, Trump would come to power at the end of Obama's 12 years on the national stage. The former First Lady. The last major figure to stand in the way. You know what's interesting as I read that, and I don't like to stop and give observations while I'm reading, but I think this warrants it. So it says Jehu would succeed King Joram. Joram had been in power on the national stage for 12 years. So if you take Obama's first 8 years, and then people speculating that he is actually running this presidency, that would be 12 years. There would be a break for 4 years for Trump, but ultimately there would be 12 years of Obama. So that's kind of interesting. The last major figure to stand in the way of Jehu's ascent was the nation's former First Lady. And so in order to become king, Jehu would have to come head to head with the nation's former First Lady. The biggest obstacle to Trump's ascent to the presidency was the nation's former First Lady, Hillary Clinton. In order to become president, Trump would have to come to a showdown with the former First Lady. When Jehu came face to face with the nation's former First Lady, it would mean the downfall of the latter. Jehu prevailed and proceeded to take the crown of kingship. Though virtually every poll showed Clinton winning decisively against Trump, the biblical paradigm said the opposite, that when the two came head to head, the former First Lady would fall and Jehu would prevail. So against almost all odds in all polls and in one of the greatest upsets in American presidential history, the First Lady was defeated and Trump won the presidency. 22 and 14 years. How long was Hillary Clinton on the national stage? She came to it with her husband and remained on it with him for 22 years. After her husband's presidency, she served as Senator and Secretary of State for 12 years. She retired from public life for 2 years, and she returned to run for president for 2 more years. So her time on the national stage was 22 years with her husband, and on her own 14 years. Her ancient prototype, the former First Lady of Israel, whom Jehu defeated, was on the national stage for 22 years with her husband, and on her own 14 years. What could a modern president have to do with the ancient god Baal and his temple? Everything. Chapter 19. The House of Fallen Children. After defeating the former First Lady, Jehu then directed his attention to the capital city of Samaria. The city was filled with corruption, immorality, and apostasy. Jehu had come to the capital with one agenda: to drain the swamp. After defeating the former First Lady, Trump turned his attention to the capital city, Washington, D.C. He had one agenda: to drain the swamp. Children of Baal. For Jehu, there was one swamp and obstacle that stood out above all others. Jehu would confront it. It had to do with Baal. Baal was the chief of the foreign gods that Israel had turned to when it departed from God, and the worship of Baal was especially associated with the nation's former First Lady. In her office as queen, she had introduced an especially virulent form of Baal worship into the land. She used the powers of state to force the people to worship Baal, the chief god of her Phoenician homeland. Those who refused to do so could be put to death. Under her rule, Baal worship became the official religion of Israel. The elements of Baal worship were typical of pagan religion: rites of nature, sensuality, sacrifices, and sexual immorality. It was the sacrifices, though, that made Israel's worship of Baal especially dark. As Baal demanded the sacrificing of their children, the land would be filled with their blood. Gods and kings. Paralleling ancient Israel's embrace of child sacrifice is America's modern embrace of abortion. In the case of Israel, the practice of child sacrifice was embarked on only as the nation turned away from God. So too, in the modern case, abortion came to America only after the nation began its departure from God. When the Israelite King Ahab and his wife Jezebel forcibly promulgated the worship of Baal across Israel, Jehu was one of their commanders. Therefore he served, defended, and supported the worship of Baal, along with its sacrifice of children. But Jehu turned against the house of Ahab and against the cult of Baal, and thus against child sacrifice. In the same way, Trump was originally a supporter of abortion. He had been friends with the former First Lady and her husband, Bill Clinton. But as did Jehu, Trump would turn against abortion. When he began his race to the White House, he did so as a staunch opponent of the practice. Showdown. During Jehu's ascent to power, the most prominent advocate of Baal worship was the nation's former First Lady. During Trump's ascent to power, the nation's most prominent advocate of abortion was the nation's former First Lady, Hillary Clinton. As the two ancient figures came head to head in what would be their final showdown, so the two modern figures came head to head in their final showdown in their last debate in the autumn of 2016. It was in that debate that Trump directly challenged Clinton in front of the nation concerning the blood of America's children. She supported the practice, but as did Jehu, Trump opposed it and pledged to war against it. Temple of Baal. When Jehu arrived in the nation's capital, Samaria, he was confronted by a massive national temple dedicated to Baal. If he was to rid the land of Baal worship, he would have to bring down that great temple. It was that temple in the capital city that stood as the center of Baal worship, and thus the axis of the system that caused children to be sacrificed. Jehu gave the orders, and the temple of Baal was destroyed. Then they broke down the sacred pillar of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal and made it a refuse dump to this day. Thus Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. The fall of the temple of Baal both epitomized and inaugurated Jehu's reign. And one of the central dynamics of the paradigm: when Jehu rises, the temple of Baal must fall. Palmyra. When Trump began his rise to power in the launching of his presidential campaign, there stood across the world in Palmyra, Syria, a temple of Baal. It was ancient. It had stood there from the days of the Roman Empire for almost 2 millennia. But according to the paradigm, when Jehu rises, the temple of Baal must fall. Trump announced his candidacy in June of 2015. 2 months later, the ancient temple of Baal that had withstood the world for nearly 2,000 years fell to the ground. The ancient paradigm had manifested. When Jehu rises, The temple of Baal must fall. The foreshadowing. And yet the fall of Baal's temple would be the prophetic foreshadowing of a coming change. The change would alter American politics and culture, but before that change would come, there would be another manifestation of the ancient temple of Jehu and the temple of Baal, the ancient template of Jehu and the temple of Baal. It would replay before the nation, before the world. Those who witnessed its replaying would have no inkling. Those members of Congress who spent countless hours in committees investigating it would likewise have no idea. But behind the event that stunned America and the world was an ancient mystery. I wrote The Paradigm in 2017. The events we are about to open happened over 3 years after its release, yet it was foreshadowed in the paradigm revealed in the book. What we are about to see is the mystery that the world could not see at the time. What we are about to see is the mystery that the world could not at the time see, and that the United States Congress could not, in the subsequent years, find. It is a mystery that I have never, until this moment, revealed in any book. If I was mean, I would stop there, but I won't. Chapter 20, Jehu and the Temple of Baal. Is it possible that behind one of the most jarring political events of modern times lies a biblical mystery? Is it possible that the answer to an event that the American government spent incalculable effort, energy, and time investigating lies not in the political or ideological realm, but in an ancient template and an event that took place over 2,500 years earlier? The rematch. In the biblical template, the rise of Jehu is linked to the fall of Baal's temple. The template, as we have seen, manifested in the rise of the modern-day Jehu and the fall of the ancient temple of Baal in Palmyra, Syria. But could there be another manifestation? And if the war of Jehu and the temple of Baal framed the beginning of Jehu's reign and the beginning of Trump's rise to the presidency, could it also have framed its end? Or could his presidency end with a replay, a rematch of the battle revealed in the template? January 6th. It was the first week of January 2021, the week that would determine the future of the United States Senate and the American presidency. It would all pivot on the middle of that week, Wednesday, when the results of the Senate race in Georgia would be known and thus which party would control the Senate. It was also the day that the votes of the 2020 presidential election would be officially sealed. Wednesday was critical, as it would give the Democrats control of Congress and the presidency. It would seal the end of Trump's days in power. It would all converge on January 6th. What happened on that day is not condoned by the template, but it is revealed and foreshadowed. Anita. Penny, I came in afterwards. Can you please share what you're reading from? I am reading the Josiah Manifesto by Jonathan Cahn. And you can always watch on Rewind. The National Temple. The temple of Baal that stood in the nation's capital city, Samaria, was in effect the nation's temple of Israel's northern kingdom. So the first question we must ask is this: is there a building in Washington, D.C. that could be deemed its national temple? It is commonly assumed that America has no national temple, but there is one. It has been called the Temple of the American Republic, the People's House, America's secular temple, and the nation's temple of democracy. It is the United States Capitol building. The Capitol building's place as America's national temple appears on its very walls, where it is written, "We have built no temple but the Capitol." Even the building refers to itself as a temple. It was modeled after the pagan temples of the ancient world, particularly those of Greece and Rome, and more specifically, the Roman pantheon, the temple of all gods. The pagan prayer. But it is not such architecture that makes a building pagan, but what happens on the inside. In the ancient temple of Baal, prayers and worship were lifted up to a pagan god. The Capitol building has traditionally seen prayers and invocations lifted up to the God of the Bible. But as the week of January 6, 2021 began, something changed. It happened on January 3rd. the first working session of the new Congress. The new Congress was inaugurated with a prayer offered by the Democratic Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. I had written of him years before in The Paradigm. He was the man who had given an unknowingly prophetic address at the Democratic convention that nominated Hillary Clinton. He would now offer up an unknowingly prophetic prayer. The problem with the prayer was the God to whom Cleaver prayed. He sealed it with the name Brahma. Brahma is an eternity away from the God of the Bible. Brahma is a Hindu god, one of three gods ruling deities, the others being Vishnu and Shiva. Brahma has 4 heads. He originally had 5, but the god Shiva cut one of them off when he was caught lying. Brahma is a pagan god. And so, on January 3rd, 2021, the 117th Congress was consecrated to a pagan god, and America's national temple became a house of prayer to a pagan god, as in a pagan temple. The agenda. Beyond prayer, the Temple of Baal housed practices and agendas that stood in opposition to the ways of God. It promoted sexual immorality and the sacrifice of children. On that first week of 2021, it was not just a pagan prayer that inaugurated the new Congress, it was an anti-biblical or pagan agenda that did. The new Democratic-controlled Congress would bring to Capitol Hill an agenda that stood in stark opposition to biblical morality and values as touching sexuality, religious freedom, gender, and lives of unborn children. The new Congress came to the Capitol building prepared to enact the most pro-abortion agenda in American history. So it was not only the prayer that turned America's temple into a pagan one, it was the agenda. The first week of 2021 was when that agenda took full control of Capitol Hill and of the temple of the American Republic. And it all happened when a Jehu was still in power and in the capital city. These were the ingredients of the ancient template. It was a battle waiting to happen. Jehu's assembly. The 10th chapter of the book of 2 Kings records that Jehu called for an assembly in the capital city. So President Trump called for an assembly in the capital city, Washington, D.C., on January 6th. Jehu's gathering would ultimately be directed at the National Temple in Capital City. Trump's gathering of January 6th would likewise be directed on America's National Temple, the Capitol building. The ancient template would center on 2 gatherings or 2 groups of people gathered in that city, the priests and worshippers of Baal, who would convene inside the temple, and the supporters of Jehu, who would stand outside the temple. So on January 6th, the gathering that convened inside the Capitol building represented the victory of an anti-biblical agenda. The gathering that took place outside the Capitol building represented the supporters of the modern-day Jehu, Trump. Jehonadab in the house. It is of note that the ancient template tells of both Jehu and his partner, Jehonadab, playing a prominent role in what happened in the Temple of Baal. So both Trump and Pence would play a prominent role in what happened on January 6th in the Capitol building, America's national temple. In the ancient template, both Jehu and Jehonadab go to Baal's temple. Trump had planned to go down to the Capitol building that day, but his security team prevented him. But Pence, the modern-day Jehonadab, did indeed enter the National Temple that day in accordance with the paradigm. It is worthy of note that though we can assume that Jehonadab left the building after entering it, the account gives no record or indication that he did. On January 6th, Pence entered the Capitol building. He never left, but would remain there through the night. Those outside the temple. In the ancient template, Jehu directed the multitude of his supporters to the temple of Baal and to stand outside it. On January 6th, Trump in effect directed the multitude of his supporters to go to the Capitol building and stand outside in protest. Jehu's supporters stood outside the National Temple while proceedings took place inside. Trump's supporters stood outside the National Temple while proceedings took place inside. The supporters of Jehu would not stay outside the Temple of Baal, and the supporters of Trump would not stay outside the Capitol building. The siege. In the biblical account of Jehu's war against the Temple of Baal, his supporters were given the word, "Go inside." Who said that? The guy that nobody wants to talk about. We're going to go inside. We're going inside the Capitol. Fed. What was that guy's name? It'll come to me. Upon that, the people of Jehu laid siege to the temple. So on January 6th, the supporters of Trump would do likewise. They believed they had the authority to go inside. So they went inside. They laid siege to it. In the ancient template, the followers of Jehu entered the temple of Baal and dramatically and violently interrupted its proceedings. On January 6th, the followers of Trump entered the Capitol building and dramatically, if less violently than the ancient case, interrupted its proceedings. Ray-ups. Thank you, Melissa. Ray-ups, yeah. It's funny that wasn't burned in my brain. In the ancient template, Jehu's followers go inside the temple to shed blood, and they do. On January 6th, though, it was not the majority. Among those who had entered the Capitol building were those calling for blood and those who had prepared for violence. Desecration. In order to prevent the temple of Baal, or the ground on which it stood, from ever being used again as the site of pagan practices, Jehu's people defiled and desecrated it. So on January 6th, among those who entered the Capitol building were those who sought to defile and desecrate it. In view of Jehu and the Temple of Baal, the reactions of members of Congress in the wake of January 6th are especially significant and consistent. The incoming Senate Majority Leader said, "This temple to democracy was desecrated." A senator speaking that night from Capitol Hill said, "This sacred place was desecrated. This temple to democracy was defiled." That's fascinating. I'm even fascinated. The Speaker of the House spoke of those who engaged in the, quote, desecration of this, our temple. Shemanim-ish, the 80 men. These Jewish words, or Hebrew words. In the wake of January 6th, the government began its crackdown against those involved with breaching the Capitol building. At the end of the week, the Washington, D.C. Police Department announced the number of those they had arrested in connection with the Capitol Hill riot. The number made headlines. 80 arrested for civil unrest at U.S. Capitol and around D.C. Metropolitan Police Department arrested 80 individuals in connection with the civil unrest at the U.S. Capitol and around D.C. So the number of those connected to the siege of the Capitol building was 80. Of course, there were more. The ancient template gives the number of Jehu's men who laid siege to the temple of Baal with two Hebrew words, Shmanim-ish. If you're Jewish, I apologize for butchering your language. The translation of Shmanim-ish, 80 men. So it is written in the ancient template. Jehu had appointed for himself men on the outside, 80 men. The same exact number. No one could have orchestrated the connection, but the template had been there for over 2,500 years. The secret of America's temple. There appears to be a secret hidden in the walls of America's temple, its Capitol building. In the years before it was planned and built, an English scholar traveled the Middle East. There he surveyed ancient ruins, ancient structures, ancient temples. He wrote a book detailing his findings with descriptions and drawings. The book was hugely influential among scholars and architects of the day. One of the ancient buildings he surveyed and wrote about was the Temple of Baal. It is believed that his book influenced those designing the United States Capitol, and that part of the Temple of Baal is actually embedded into the Capitol building. Further, the particular Temple of Baal that he surveyed happened to be the Temple of Palmyra, Syria. In other words, it was the same ancient temple that would fall to the earth 2 months after Trump began his rise to power. Templates and prototypes. As the ancient Jehu contended against the great national temple, the modern-day Jehu contended against America's great national temple. The modern Jehu had no idea of the ancient temple, or of his ancient prototype, or of the role he was to play. But nor did the 80 participants in the January 6th siege of the Capitol building have any idea of the 80 who had laid siege to the Temple of Baal on Jehu's behalf. It didn't matter. The parallels were natural. The template manifested regardless. The reign of Baal. The siege against Baal's temple and its subsequent fall framed the beginning of Jehu's reign. The fall of Baal's temple likewise framed the beginning of Trump's ascent to power. But in the case of Trump, just as it had framed the beginning of the reign, it would also frame the end. It is no accident that the ancient template replayed itself on the very day that sealed the end of his presidency. It was, in a sense, a rematch. Only this time the modern Jehu and his forces would not prevail. It was a sign that the agenda of Baal would be prevailing in America, and his influence would rest on the thrones of both political and cultural power. But what happened on January 6, 2021 was not the end of the story, not of the template, and not of the battle of Jehu in the Temple of Baal. There would be another manifestation. In many ways, this one would be the most significant. It would become the key to joining together the mysteries of Jehu and those that preceded him, as well as those that would follow. We now open that last manifestation of Jehu and the Temple of Baal, and that's where we'll stop today. That's chapter 21. What do you guys think? Are you enjoying it? I'm enjoying it. My hand is so cold. My hands are cold. I'm cold. I should have turned the fan off, but I was hot when I sat down. You know how that goes. Welcome menopause. I always say that, but I had a hysterectomy at 32, so I don't think I can claim that as my excuse anymore for being either hot or cold. Fascinating. Did you like it? Good, Anita. I'm glad. It's really interesting, isn't it? It's. I think that Jonathan Cahn has a divinely given gift of being able to draw parallels. I've not seen anybody that is so, and I'm curious to know, because I know he was an atheist, and then later in life, he becomes Jewish, and I mean, I think his family was Jewish, but he didn't believe, um, and I think he had like a brush with death, and that's what turned him around. I'll have to look that up, but just interesting that who God uses. I always say that. I say that to you guys all the time. Who am I that God would use me in such a way? Who are you that God would use you in the ways he uses you? And if God's not using you, you probably need to look around and see where God is working and get involved. But it's just interesting to me that um, God will take these minor players. Um, I mean, you couldn't have gotten a more um, unusual president than Trump, could you? And when you look back at his history, that the irony is rich. That he was close friends with the Clintons and supported their Bill's campaign. Um, it's just interesting the 180 that had to come from him, and what would bring that about. And it was in large part it was financial. He didn't like the way the country was going financially, how our trade deals were unfair, all this sort of thing. But then eventually it becomes a moral issue for him. um, and I know he became a believer. I don't know at what point, if it was during his campaign or just before, but pretty close, to when he became president. And so it's interesting to see that take that he originally had, which was, we're making stupid foreign trade deals and things like that, to this issue of morality and religion and life and those sorts of things. That's why I'm hoping he doesn't veer from that. I think there's a lot of pressure, um, to win, and I think a lot of people think you can do that with compromise, and I don't think you can win. Um, Not a presidential race with compromise. I don't think you can. I think you have to be bold and strong and believe what you say and either win or lose based on that. Um, and I think that's true for life. You have to, yes, there are places for compromise, but they are not on the grounds of our faith, um, and of our moral compass. Those are the areas where we don't compromise if we're uncompromising people. Melissa says, I can't help but think that some of this ancient information is known by both sides, and each coping the current story for their advantage. Just my take on, yeah, I'm sure there's, but how would you orchestrate that? People have, and I get your point, people know this and they're orchestrating, but boy, would that be hard to orchestrate. It's kind of like a lot of people will say, and I'm not saying you're saying this, Melissa. A lot of people will say, oh, Jesus knew the prophecies and Jesus walked that path so people would believe that he was the Son of God. And I'm like, well, that's an awful lot of orchestrating because, you've got to arrange the crucifixion, you've got to arrange, your arrest, all these things that would have been out of his hands. Um, that doesn't, now that said, that doesn't mean that higher powers aren't moving the pieces. Anita says, regarding the numbers earlier, it came to me an eye for an eye. Yeah, it does, doesn't it, Anita? This idea that um, that the lives that were taken, the children that weren't born because their lives were taken, at some point there's a cost to that and it has to be paid. The collector comes, right? The tax man cometh. You have to pay for the wrong you did at some point. I always used to tell my kids, you can do something wrong and in that moment think you've gotten away with it. But somehow, the older you get, the more you realize this, it comes back on you. You do have to pay for that sin. It's not, even if you're just paying for it in worry, in this sort of trepidation that you're going to pay for it. Maybe the consequence never comes, but the worry is punishment enough, right? So there's things that we've all done that we ruminate on and we're paying for them daily just by not being able to get them out of our head and by torturing ourselves over them. And so, yeah, I think eventually every good and bad thing um, has its repayment. And we want to put more good out there into the world so that we're getting good for good and not evil for evil. But yeah, I think an eye for an eye is very fitting there. Um, but anyway, just wow, I love his writing. He's such an interesting book. I probably could read every single thing. Um, hold on, I lost my chat over here. There we go. I probably could read every single thing that Jonathan Cahn writes, and I'm one that kind of thinks about it. That's why we do these a week apart and not every single day till we finish the book, because I need time. That's a lot to digest if you think about it. Um, with the numbers of the abortion and the plague and that there was that part of me that was reading that part about the numbers of people that died of COVID or with COVID or whatever you want to call it. um, there's that part of me that's like, well, but some of those people probably were staunchly against abortion. Some of those people probably took in tons of foster kids and things like that. And but that is, the it rains on the just and the unjust alike, doesn't it? We're seeing that now in with the war that's going on between Gaza and Israel. People in Israel who did nothing wrong, who are not part of um, the government or anything like that, died, and people in Gaza, who are just people who can't get out of there, they're dying, and have done nothing wrong, and that is, what does it say about sin? The wages of sin are death, and it's true. Eventually, it comes, and it's not always just. And I've been thinking about that a lot this week, reading Jonathan Cahn. I actually got online the other day and looked to see if he has any. It was like the day after the attack. I looked to see if he had anything to say about it, and I couldn't find anything. But I'll look again because I imagine by now he's had some kind of take on it. But I'm trying to educate myself on Israel. I know a lot of people are saying, "Well, I'm not taking a side. I don't know what's going on there. I just don't want to get involved." And how long did we say that over abortion? I'm not taking a side. I'm not the one that's pregnant. I'm a man. I can't get involved. I have no say. Well, you do. If that's your child, you have a say. You should have a say anyway. Um, and so I feel like there's this Bible verse and it says, you're neither hot nor cold, so I spit you out of my mouth. God says this, be one way or the other, take a side. And it's so hard because we don't want to take sides. We don't want to offend anybody. So I've been working really hard to educate myself on the geopolitics of what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Israel. And it's a tough it's so hard. I don't want to see any innocent person perish, but I don't want to see evil prevail either. And sadly, in the stopping of evil, innocence perishes. It just does. It's just terrible. Um, and I was trying to think of a solution for the Palestinians there in Gaza. What do we do? And the issue is no one else will take them either. So like it borders Egypt, Gaza borders Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. And Jordan and the people in Gaza are primarily Muslim people. I'm not saying that as a judgment, I'm saying that as a fact. Um, and nobody else wants them because this particular people group, I'm guessing because of their culture and their history, they destabilize every place they go. And so Egypt won't let them in, and Egypt is primarily Muslim. Jordan won't let them in. Jordan is primarily Muslim. And it was funny because I was listening to people talk about, how Israel is occupying. Well, they're not occupying. They're not in Gaza. Um, and and I don't think this is a genocide because you have Arab people who go to mosque in Israel, and those people are not being killed or, you know, uh, they can put down their mats and pray, and everything is fine with that. Now, if you're not going to go to Gaza and find a temple to go in and have your Jewish time of prayer. They would burn that to the ground and kill those people on site. So I think there is a difference there. But I do definitely feel for all the people that have been born into the poverty of Gaza that have nowhere else to go because they've elected Hamas to run them. They've elected this terrorist organization, and my guess is those people aren't easily gotten out of power. They're once you elect them, that's it. You are under their thumb, and they're just in a terrible position. And I feel badly for everybody involved. Um, but I have to take the side of, we don't start it. They started it, and I think a lot of people will say, well, they've been through a lot and they're fighting for freedom. Well, you don't really get freedom by killing just regular everyday citizens. That generally there's a price to pay for that, right? It comes back. Evil is repaid with evil. It's just, I don't know. The whole thing is terrible. It's been terrible my whole life. The goings on between the Palestinians and Israel, and I think people are like, well, we need to come up with a two-state solution. Well, you can't really come up with a two-state solution when the Palestinians are saying from the river to the sea, which means that they will eliminate all Jews from the river to the sea. That's their solution. Their solution is we will kill all Jews, death to America, death to Christians. It's pretty hard to come to a working um, uh, what was the word I'm looking for? Like a working compromise when their goal is that you're dead. You can look in like on Iran on their government workings, and they're all standing together facing the cameras yelling death to America, death to Israel. There's no compromise with that. How do you well, we'll let you kill half of us. you, it's just you can't win with that as your goal, and it doesn't inspire a two-state solution or any solution for that matter, um, because one party is bent on death and destruction. And so what do? You contain those people as best you can. It would be great if some of the Muslim countries would take them in, but they won't. So what do you do when a people group won't take in their own people group because they're destabilizing even within their own group? It's very difficult. Like I said, my heart breaks for what I'm seeing going on in both places. But how do you work with terrorists? And terrorists don't care how many of their civilians they have to stack in front of this target and have them killed for a photo op just so they've got some propaganda. It's just terrible. And I'm sure there's fault on the side of the Israeli government. And I probably never would have said that before. But learning what I've learned about our government over the last 3 years, the nature of government is corruption. I just think that's true. I mean, show me a government that isn't rife with corruption, and I'll probably just fall over in shock. So, I think there's probably fault to be had on both sides, and perhaps, um, there are some patterns and paradigms there as well. It'll be interesting to see what Jonathan Cahn writes in the future concerning, this historical context. Anita's got to run. I used to teach my kids, and everything you do, there is a consequence. There is, whether it's realized immediately in that moment or years and years later, or in sometimes the consequence is just a degrading of your own goodness and your own soul, but you do pay a price. Let's get sewing. Synchronicity is amazing. It is. All right, guys, I'm going to pray us out because my voice is weak, and I definitely want to do a Friday show this week, barring anything weird. I think we're on track for being able to pick back up on Fridays. I'm so excited. I've been super careful with my diet and all my meds and everything so that I can get to consistently feeling better. And they say the Carafate, that's a medicine that you take for healing ulcers. It takes weeks. And so I'm at about a month and I'm starting to feel better. So I think that's probably the case. Um, and then of course we'll hit the surgery and that'll put us on the skids for a while, but it is what it is. And we get through, don't we? All right, guys. Melissa says, thank you for your explanation of the situation. I've learned a lot today, for I'm not understood at all. Yeah, me too. I'm still really struggling in my spirit, because I don't want violence and I don't want death and I don't want this. It gets me even sitting here, just the faces of the children. They're just so shell shocked on both sides by what's going on. It's just heartbreaking. You look healthy and strong. Thank you, Christopher Sandman. I appreciate that. I am feeling better. It's taken a little time, but I'm trying to be diligent with my health. Don always says, you're a sports car babe, which means you got to work on me all week to be able to take me out on the weekend. That's okay. As he's getting older, he's getting to be a little bit of a sports car too. His knees are hurting and things like that. Um, Such as aging, but I'd prefer that to the alternative right now. All right, guys, let me pray us out. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time together, and we pray blessings on Rabbi Cahn and all the work that he does and the teaching that he does and opening your word up to us. It's especially the great mysteries of the Old Testament. I think the New Testament is pretty straightforward, and we can glean quite a bit from it. But the history and the culture and everything that goes with the Old Testament has seemed closed to me until I started reading his books. And so I thank you for putting him in my path and helping me to share his writing with others. And Father, I would just pray for everybody that was here live today and everybody who will watch on Rewind. I pray for all of the unspoken prayers, all the struggles that people are going through, pain, suffering, loneliness. So many people reach out to me struggling with separation from their family over the issues of the day. And Father, I pray that you would bring love and reconciliation, and that you would remind us that we have to work together. We have to find a way, and that you would soften the hearts of family members who are just so um, unwavering in their want to be unforgiving and unaccommodating of the beliefs of other people. I pray that you would soften that and remind them that in the end, family is what holds us together. It's the glue, and we've got to have that. And I know that's part of this horrible pagan conspiracy, is to break apart families. And I think that was in large part what was going on with COVID and with politics. It's to divide families. And we have to fight that. We have to, once we're divided, that's it, Father. And I pray that you would bring reconciliation and healing and forgiveness. Most of all, that's mostly what we need. And most of all, Father, I pray that you would bring us reconciliation and forgiveness and healing for how we've walked away from you and how we have disdained you and tried to make our own way and live our own lives and push you to the side. And we can see the what's resulted from that. And it's not good. It's not what we want. It's not the life we want for ourselves or our children or grandchildren. And I pray that you would help us come into alignment with the Word of God and come back under your wing, and where we can take advantage of your love and protection. And I just pray that you would grant that to us. Father, for anybody here today that doesn't know your son, Jesus, and doesn't know the love and the sacrifice and just the wiping away of all of those things that we ruminate over, that we've done wrong, or how we've been hurt over the years, how Jesus can wash that off us. Father, I pray if there's anybody here that doesn't know that love for Jesus, that they would come to know that love of Jesus, and know that they too can be included in this family. We have to come back together as a family. And to do that, we have to repent. We have to admit what we've done wrong. We have to admit how we've pushed away the gift of Christ. And I pray that in our confession of that, you would bring reconciliation and healing and oneness back to the family of God. Father, I thank you so much for this platform, and I pray that you would help me be worthy of it every single day. Most of all, I thank you for Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, guys. I love you whole big bunches. I will see you on Friday, like I said, barring anything unforeseen. I feel like I'm on a pretty steady track and we can do a Friday without me having to bow out earlier. Oh, that was so embarrassing. But I know you guys love me and you pray for me, and that means a lot to me. So I will see you guys on Friday. I love you whole big bunches. Nurse Penny out.